Let me tell you about one of the most insane logistical challenges any country has ever attempted. Imagine waking up one morning and everything you know about driving, everything you've learned since you got your license, every instinct you've developed over years behind the wheel, suddenly becomes wrong. Not gradually, not over time, but literally overnight. This actually happened, and it happened to an entire country of nearly 8 million people all at once. September 3rd, 1967, Sweden. The day they called Dagen H. The day Sweden switched from driving on the left side of the road to driving on the right. And I'm not talking about a small change here. I'm talking about every single car, every bus, every truck, every motorcycle in the entire country having to change sides at exactly the same moment. We're talking about a country that had been driving on the left for as long as anyone could remember, suddenly flipping everything in reverse. And here's the thing that blows my mind: they pulled it off with almost no casualties, in a coordinated effort that involved millions of people, tens of thousands of vehicles, and required changing literally everything about how transportation worked in their country. So how did they do it? Why did they do it? And what can this teach us about human coordination and the possibility of massive change? Stay with me because this story is absolutely wild. Let's set the scene. It's the 1960s. Sweden is a modern, prosperous nation. They've got great infrastructure, excellent roads, and a population that's pretty happy with how things are going. But there's this one quirk. While most of mainland Europe drives on the right side of the road, Sweden drives on the left, just like the UK, just like Japan, just like Australia. Now you might be thinking, okay, so what? Plenty of countries drive on the left. What's the big deal? Well, here's where it gets complicated. Sweden is surrounded by countries that drive on the right, Norway to the west, Finland to the east, Denmark to the south, and remember, this is 1960s Europe. Borders are becoming more open, trade is increasing, tourism is booming, people are traveling between countries more than ever before. And every single time someone crosses the border from Sweden into Norway or Finland or takes the ferry to Denmark, they have to switch sides of the road. Can you imagine? You're driving along in Sweden, everything's normal, you're on the left side of the road like you've always been. Then you hit the border, and suddenly you need to cross over and start driving on the right. Then when you come back to Sweden, you switch again. It sounds like a recipe for disaster, right? And it was. The border crossings were becoming increasingly dangerous. Accidents were happening. Confusion was constant. Plus, here's another problem that people don't always think about. Swedish cars. Most cars manufactured in Sweden in the 1960s had the steering wheel on the left side. Yes, you heard that right. They were driving on the left side of the road, but their steering wheels were on the left side of the car. Why? Because Swedish car manufacturers like Volvo were building cars primarily for export. They were making left-hand drive cars because that's what most of the world wanted. That's what mainland Europe needed. That's what the massive American market demanded. So Sweden had this bizarre situation where people were driving on the left side of the road while sitting on the left side of the car. Think about what that means for visibility. When you're trying to pass another vehicle, you can't see oncoming traffic properly. You're essentially blind. It's dangerous, really dangerous. The Swedish government knew they had a problem. And they'd known it for a while. The debate about switching sides actually started way back in the 1920s. Can you believe that? They'd been talking about this for over 40 years before they actually did it. In 1955, the government held a referendum. They asked the Swedish people directly, should we switch from left to right? The results, 83% said no. 83% of Swedes voted to keep driving on the left. They didn't want to change, and honestly, you can understand why. Change is scary, especially change that involves something as fundamental as how you drive, something you do every single day, something where mistakes can literally kill you. The Swedish people looked at this proposal and said no thank you, we're fine the way we are. But here's the thing about referendums. They're advisory. The government doesn't have to follow them. And the Swedish government, looking at the increasing number of accidents, looking at the growing integration with the rest of Europe, looking at the fundamental safety problems with their current system, decided they had to act. In 1963, the Swedish Parliament, the Riksdag, voted to make the switch despite the referendum results. They set the date, September 3, 1967. They gave themselves 4 years to prepare. 4 years to figure out how to change everything about how an entire country moves. So they created this organization, Statens Högertrafik Commission. Try saying that 3 times fast. In English, it's the State Right-Hand Traffic Commission. And they gave this commission an absolutely monumental task. Figure out how to switch an entire country from left to right-hand traffic with minimum chaos and minimum casualties. The man put in charge was a guy named Gunnar Brodden. And let me tell you, Gunnar Brodden had possibly one of the most stressful jobs in human history. He had to coordinate something that had never been done before at this scale. Sure, other countries had switched sides. Parts of Austria had done it. Czechoslovakia had done it. But those were either smaller populations or it happened under very different circumstances, often after wars or territorial changes. Sweden was attempting something unprecedented, a peaceful, planned, coordinated switch for an entire modern nation, and they had 4 years to make it happen. The first thing they realized was that infrastructure was going to be a massive problem. Think about it. Every single road sign in the entire country was positioned for left-hand traffic. Every bus stop was on the wrong side. Every loading zone, every taxi stand, every parking configuration. Traffic lights were positioned for drivers on the left. Road markings assumed left-hand traffic. Intersection designs were built for left-hand traffic. Highway on-ramps and off-ramps, all designed for left-hand traffic. Everything had to change. They calculated that they needed to modify or replace over 360,000 road signs. 360,000. They had to repaint every single road marking in the country. They had to physically move thousands of bus stops to the opposite side of the street. They had to reconfigure entire intersections. In Stockholm alone, they had to modify or replace 8,000 bus stop signs and poles. And here's where it gets even more complicated. Traffic lights. In Sweden at the time, traffic lights were positioned on the left side of the road so drivers could see them easily. But if you're suddenly driving on the right, you can't see those traffic lights anymore. They're on the wrong side, so they had to either move them or install new ones. In major cities, they decided to install completely new traffic light systems with lights positioned for right-hand traffic. But they couldn't do it early because that would confuse current left-hand traffic. So they installed these new traffic lights but kept them covered, wrapped up, waiting for the big day. Then there was the question of vehicles themselves. Remember, most cars in Sweden already had left-hand drive, so that was actually helpful for the switch. But what about buses? Buses in Sweden were built with doors on the right side, so passengers could board from the curb when driving on the left. After the switch, those doors would be on the traffic side, incredibly dangerous. So Sweden had to buy approximately 8,000 new buses, 8,000 in 4 years. This created a massive boom for bus manufacturers. Volvo and Scania were working overtime to produce these buses. And it wasn't just buses. What about all the specialized vehicles, delivery trucks with side doors, street sweepers, garbage trucks, postal vehicles, emergency vehicles? Every single one had to be evaluated and many had to be replaced or modified. The cost was enormous. The estimates vary, but the total cost of Dagen H was somewhere between 2 and 3 billion Swedish krona in 1967 money. That's equivalent to several $billions today. It was one of the most expensive infrastructure projects in Swedish history. But money was just part of the problem. The bigger challenge was human beings. How do you get millions of people to change a deeply ingrained habit? Think about your own driving. How much of it is automatic? You don't consciously think about which side of the road to drive on. You just do it. It's muscle memory, it's instinct. Now imagine trying to reprogram that instinct for an entire population. The Swedish government knew that education was going to be critical. They launched one of the most comprehensive public awareness campaigns ever attempted. They created a logo for the transition, a simple, striking design with arrows showing the switch from left to right. They put this logo everywhere, on milk cartons, on postage stamps, on underwear. Yes, really. Some enterprising company made Dagen H underwear with the logo. The idea was total saturation. Make it impossible for anyone in Sweden to not know about the coming change. They produced films and television programs explaining the switch. They held public meetings, they distributed pamphlets, they created special educational materials for schools. Kids came home with Dagen H coloring books and worksheets. They figured if you can get the kids to understand it, they'll educate their parents too. They held training sessions for professional drivers, bus drivers, truck drivers, taxi drivers. These were the people who drove for a living, who spent hours every day on the road. They needed special preparation. Thousands of drivers attended intensive courses on right-hand traffic. They practiced on closed courses. They studied new rules and regulations. They even changed the driving test. Anyone taking their driving test in the months before Dagen H had to demonstrate proficiency in both left-hand and right-hand traffic. Talk about confusing. The government also worked with businesses. Any company that had delivery vehicles, any company whose employees drove as part of their job, they all received special guidance. The postal service, utility companies, construction firms, everyone had to prepare. Insurance companies had to figure out new policies and coverage. Hospitals prepared for a potential surge in accidents. Extra ambulances were put on stand-by. Trauma centers were fully staffed. Police forces trained for the transition. They developed special procedures for directing traffic during the switch. They prepared for every possible scenario. And then there was the question of timing. When exactly do you make the switch? You can't do it during regular traffic hours. Can you imagine trying to switch sides while cars are actively driving around? Total chaos. So they decided on a Sunday, September 3rd, 1967. A Sunday because traffic volumes would be lower. People would be home, fewer commercial vehicles on the road. But what time on Sunday? They chose to do it overnight, transitioning from Saturday night into Sunday morning. But the actual moment of the switch, 5 in the morning, right before dawn, before the morning rush but late enough that the nighttime traffic would have died down. They called it Högertrafikomläggningen, the right-hand traffic diversion. H-Day, Dagen H. The H stood for Höger, which means right in Swedish. Everything was building toward this single moment, this one morning when everything would change. Now let's talk about what actually happened. The preparation in the final weeks before Dagen H was intense. Remember all those covered traffic lights I mentioned? In the weeks leading up to the switch, workers were out installing the final equipment. Road crews were out preparing new road markings, but they couldn't paint them yet. They couldn't put up the new signs yet. Everything had to wait for the actual transition, so they prepared everything to be changed as quickly as possible. On Saturday, September 2nd, 1967, Sweden essentially shut down. At 1 p.m. that afternoon, all non-essential traffic was banned in major cities. Only emergency vehicles, buses, and specially authorized vehicles were allowed on the roads. People were told to stay home, businesses closed, the streets emptied. It must have been eerie. These normally bustling cities suddenly silent and empty on a Saturday afternoon. Then the work began. Thousands of workers fanned out across the country. They started uncovering the new traffic lights. They started putting up the new road signs. They started painting the new road markings. In Stockholm, workers removed the old center line on major streets and painted a new one. They covered up old road markings with black paint and added new ones. They installed new signs at what seemed like every intersection. It was a logistical ballet involving tens of thousands of people, all working to a precise timeline. The Swedish military was called in to help. Soldiers worked alongside civilian crews. Everyone had their assigned tasks. Everyone knew where they needed to be and what they needed to do. As the night went on, more and more of the infrastructure was ready. New signs up, new markings down, traffic lights repositioned. Meanwhile, Swedish television was broadcasting special programming. They showed footage of the work being done. They had experts explaining what was happening. They reminded people of the rules. They showed animations of how the transition would work. The whole country was watching. And then, as 5 a.m. approached, something remarkable happened. The few vehicles that were still on the road, the authorized vehicles, the buses running reduced service, they all pulled over and stopped. At exactly 4:50 am, all traffic in Sweden came to a complete halt. For 10 minutes, the roads of Sweden were empty, completely empty. Cars, buses, trucks, all pulled over to the side of the road, waiting. Can you imagine that moment, the silence, an entire country holding its breath? And then at 5 am exactly it happened, the signal was given, vehicles carefully pulled out from their stops and crossed to the right side of the road, just like that. In major cities where traffic was being managed, police directed the transition. They had vehicles move in coordinated groups. In Stockholm, buses started driving again on the right side. The new traffic lights lit up for the first time. The new signs were now in use. The new road markings guided traffic. Outside the major cities, where traffic volumes were even lower, individual drivers made the switch. They pulled out and moved to the right. It must have felt so strange, so wrong and right at the same time. Everything you'd been told for the past 4 years, all that preparation, suddenly becoming real, and you know what, it worked. The coordination was incredible. Reports from across the country showed the same thing. The transition was smooth. There was no massive pileup, no catastrophic accidents, no chaos. People followed the instructions, they drove carefully, they paid attention. At 6 am, just 1 hour after the switch, the ban on non-essential traffic was lifted in most areas. In the biggest cities, they kept restrictions until later in the day. Stockholm kept major restrictions until 3 p.m. to allow more time for people to adjust. But gradually, traffic returned to normal. Or rather, to the new normal. Swedish people started driving on the right side of the road, and they kept doing it. The government had prepared for the worst. They expected accidents. They expected confusion. They expected problems, but what happened was remarkable. In the days immediately following Dagen H, traffic accidents actually decreased, not increased, decreased. In the week after the switch, there were fewer traffic accidents than a typical week in Sweden. Why? Because people were being incredibly careful. Everyone was hyper-aware. No one was driving on autopilot. Everyone was paying attention, driving slowly, watching for problems. It was probably the safest Swedish roads had ever been. Of course, this didn't last forever. As people got comfortable with right-hand traffic, as it became the new normal, as old habits reasserted themselves, accident rates gradually returned to normal levels. But there was no spike, no wave of crashes. The transition worked. But the story doesn't end on September 3rd. The adjustment took time. The government kept the awareness campaign running for months afterward. They kept reminding people, they kept the Dagen H logo visible, they wanted to make sure the new behavior became ingrained. There were some problems, of course, some confusion. In rural areas, on small country roads where there was no new signage yet, some people occasionally drifted back to the left side out of habit. There were reports of confused elderly drivers who struggled with the change. There were a few minor accidents caused by people momentarily forgetting which side they should be on, but these were exceptions. The The vast majority of Swedish drivers adapted quickly. Within a few months, driving on the right felt normal. The new generation of drivers who got their licenses after Dagen H never knew anything else. And here's something interesting. Remember those border crossings that were so dangerous before? The ones that prompted this whole thing? Those became much safer. Swedish drivers no longer had to switch sides when crossing into Norway or Finland or taking the ferry to Denmark. The entire flow of traffic across Scandinavia became more coherent. The integration with the rest of Europe became smoother. So why am I telling you this story? What's the point beyond just a fascinating historical curiosity? I think Dagen H teaches us some really important lessons about change and human coordination. First, it shows us that massive, coordinated change is possible. We live in an era where we're facing enormous challenges: climate change, infrastructure modernization, digital transformation, healthcare reform. These problems can feel overwhelming, they can feel impossible. But Sweden showed that with proper planning, with clear communication, with political will, with public cooperation, you can coordinate millions of people to change fundamental behaviors all at once. And you can do it successfully. Second, it shows the power of clear deadlines. Sweden didn't say we're going to gradually transition over 10 years. They picked a date. They said this is when it's happening. Everyone prepare. That clarity focused efforts. It made planning possible. It created urgency. Third, it demonstrates the importance of comprehensive preparation. The Swedish government didn't just announce the change and hope for the best. They spent 4 years preparing. They thought through every detail. They identified every problem. They allocated resources. They educated the public. They tested solutions. When the day came, they were ready. Fourth, it shows the value of public engagement. The Swedish government didn't try to hide what they were doing or minimize the scale of the change. They put the logo on underwear, for crying out loud. They made it impossible to ignore. They brought the public into the process. They made people feel part of something historic. And fifth, it shows that sometimes leadership means going against public opinion for the greater good. Remember, 83% of Swedes voted against the switch in that referendum. But the government, looking at the evidence, looking at the safety data, looking at the future of European integration, decided it had to be done. And they were right. In hindsight, basically everyone agrees that switching to right-hand traffic was the correct decision. It made Sweden safer. It made regional travel easier. It aligned Sweden with its neighbors. Sometimes leaders have to lead even when it's unpopular. Now, I'm not saying that ignoring public opinion is always okay. Democracy matters. Public input matters. But sometimes, on technical questions where the public might not have all the information, where emotional resistance is natural, but the long-term benefits are clear, responsible leadership means making tough decisions. Let's also talk about what Sweden did right in terms of the actual logistics, because there are lessons here for anyone planning any kind of major project or transition. They broke the problem down into manageable pieces. Infrastructure, vehicles, public education, professional training, emergency preparedness, legal framework. Each piece had its own team, its own budget, its own timeline. They worked in parallel. They didn't try to do everything at once. They phased the work. They did what they could in advance and saved what had to be done at the last minute for the last minute. They built in redundancy, extra buses, extra ambulances, extra police, extra public information. They over-prepared. They assumed things would go wrong and planned accordingly. And when things went better than expected, that was a bonus. They used clear, consistent branding. That Dagen H logo was everywhere. It became instantly recognizable. It unified the entire campaign under one symbol. Everyone knew what it meant. They leveraged media effectively. This was before the internet, before social media, but they used the tools they had. Television, radio, newspapers, posters. They created films. They got the message out through every available channel. They engaged trusted messengers. They trained driving instructors who then trained students. They worked with employers who then trained employees. They created cascading networks of information. They set clear rules and enforced them. That Saturday afternoon traffic ban wasn't a suggestion. It was law. Police enforced it. People followed it because they knew it was serious. They created the right incentives. Businesses that needed new buses got subsidies. Insurance companies offered better rates for safety. There were both carrots and sticks, and perhaps most importantly, they committed fully. This wasn't a pilot program. This wasn't let's try it in one city and see how it goes. It was the whole country all at once. That level of commitment made it clear that this was really happening. There was no going back. No one could sit on the sidelines and wait to see how it went. Everyone had to participate. The results speak for themselves. Dagen H is now considered one of the most successful large-scale infrastructure projects in modern history. It's studied in urban planning programs. It's used as a case study in change management. It's referenced in discussions about public policy implementation. Sweden pulled off something that seemed impossible, and they did it with minimal disruption and minimal casualties. Now let's talk about some of the unexpected consequences and interesting side effects of Dagen H. One thing that happened was a boom in the Swedish auto industry. Remember all those new buses that had to be purchased? That was a huge injection of orders for Swedish manufacturers. Volvo and Scania had more work than they could handle. The ripple effects went through the entire supply chain. Steel manufacturers, parts suppliers, assembly workers. The economic stimulus was significant. There was also an interesting effect on urban planning. When cities had to reconfigure their bus stops and traffic patterns, many took the opportunity to make other improvements. They redesigned problematic intersections. They added pedestrian crossings. They improved signage generally, not just traffic direction signs. Stockholm used the transition as an opportunity to modernize its entire urban traffic system. In a way, Dagen H forced Sweden to update infrastructure that might have otherwise been neglected for years. It was disruptive, yes, but it also accelerated improvements that were needed anyway. Another interesting effect was on Swedish national identity. Dagen H became a source of pride. Swedes had done something difficult. They'd done it together. They'd done it well. It became part of the national story. We're the country that switched sides of the road overnight and made it work. It reinforced certain Swedish cultural values. Planning, cooperation, trust in institutions, collective action. These are all things that Swedish culture already valued, and Dagen H seemed to vindicate those values. It showed that they worked. There was also an interesting generational effect. People who were adults during Dagen H, who remember the switch, they became like a special cohort. They could tell stories about the day everything changed. Kids who grew up after Dagen H can't really imagine it. Driving on the left seems impossible to them, but their parents or grandparents remember. They remember the preparation, the tension, the actual day. It's like how people remember where they were for other historic moments. Where were you during Dagen H became a meaningful question in Swedish society. And here's something that might surprise you. After Sweden switched, it influenced other countries. Iceland had been driving on the left as well. After seeing Sweden's success, Iceland switched to the right-hand traffic in 1968, just 1 year after Sweden. They basically copied Sweden's playbook. They learned from Sweden's experience, both what worked and what could be improved. And it went even more smoothly in Iceland, partly because they had Sweden's example to follow and partly because Iceland was much smaller with a much smaller population. Sweden had essentially beta-tested the process for them. In recent decades, there have been other switches. Samoa switched from right to left in 2009. That's right, they went the opposite direction. They did it to align better with nearby Australia and New Zealand. And guess what they studied when preparing Dagen H? They looked at Sweden's planning, Sweden's education campaign, Sweden's phased approach. The lessons of Dagen H continue to be relevant more than 50 years later. Now, I want to address something that might be on your mind. You might be thinking, okay, this is a cool story, but what does this have to do with my life? Why should I care about something that happened in Sweden in 1967? Fair question. Let me tell you why I think this matters. We're living through a period of rapid change. Technology is evolving faster than ever. Society is transforming. The way we work is changing. The climate is changing. The economy is changing. Political systems are being challenged and reformed, and all of this change can feel overwhelming. It can feel chaotic. It can feel like things are spiraling out of control. But Dagen H reminds us that change doesn't have to be chaotic. Change can be planned. Change can be managed. Change can be successful. It takes work, yes. It takes preparation. It takes leadership. It takes public buy-in. But it's possible. Think about the changes happening in your own life or in your own community. Maybe your workplace is going through a digital transformation. Maybe your city is trying to improve public transit. Maybe your school district is reforming its curriculum. Maybe you're personally trying to make a major life change. The principles of Dagen H apply: clear goals, comprehensive planning, effective communication, public engagement, adequate resources, committed leadership. These things work whether you're switching an entire country's traffic direction or trying to implement a new system at your office. Another lesson is about the importance of sometimes making unpopular decisions for the right reasons. Remember that referendum: 83% opposed, but the government pushed ahead because they'd looked at the data. They'd seen the accidents, they'd understood the long-term trajectory, and they were right. Sometimes what's popular isn't what's best. Sometimes leaders have to lead, of course. This needs to be balanced with democratic accountability. The Swedish government didn't just ignore the people entirely. They spent 4 years bringing the public along. They educated, they explained, they justified. By the time Dagen H actually happened, while maybe not everyone was enthusiastic, most people understood why it was necessary. That's different from just dictating from above. It's about persuasion and preparation alongside decision-making. Another lesson is about the power of deadlines and commitment. If Sweden had said, we're going to gradually encourage people to drive on the right over the next decade, it never would have worked. You can't have some people driving on the left and some on the right. It had to be everyone at once. That required a hard deadline. That required total commitment. In our own lives, we often avoid hard deadlines. We say, I'll gradually get healthier. I'll slowly improve my skills. I'll eventually make that change, but sometimes you need a Dagen H moment. A clear line in the sand. Before this date, things are this way. After this date, things are that way. That clarity can be powerful. Let's also talk about the economic aspect, because this is important. Dagen H was expensive, really expensive. Multiple billions in 1967 money. That's a massive investment. The Swedish government had to justify that expense to taxpayers. They had to make the case that this was worth it. And they did make that case. They pointed to the cost of accidents, the cost of inefficiency at borders, the cost of maintaining a system that was out of step with neighboring countries. They argued that while the upfront cost was high, the long-term benefits would more than justify it, and they were right. The reduction in accidents alone probably paid for the transition over time, the improved efficiency of cross-border traffic. The benefits to Swedish auto manufacturers who could now focus on one type of vehicle, the integration with European markets, all of these things had economic value. This is a lesson for any kind of major investment. You have to look beyond the immediate cost and consider the long-term return. Too often, we focus on what something costs right now without considering what it will save or earn over time. Sweden took the long view. They made a significant investment for long-term benefit, and it paid off. There's also something to be said about the role of expertise and technocrats in this story. The people who planned Dagen H weren't politicians primarily. They were engineers, traffic specialists, urban planners, logistics experts. The government empowered these experts to design the solution. The politicians set the goal and provided the resources, but they let the experts figure out the how. This is an important model. Not every decision should be made by popular vote. Not every solution should be designed by committee. Sometimes you need to trust experts. Sometimes you need to let people who actually know what they're doing do their jobs. Of course, this has to be balanced with democratic oversight and accountability. But the Swedish approach of setting clear political goals and then empowering technical experts to achieve those goals is a model that worked well. Compare this to situations where politicians micromanage technical decisions or where popular opinion overrides expert advice. Those situations often don't end well. Sweden found a good balance. Let me tell you about some of the personal stories from Dagen H, because I think these bring the whole thing to life. There was a bus driver named Anders who'd been driving for 20 years. He was interviewed before Dagen H and said he was terrified. Driving was his livelihood, it was his career, and he was being asked to completely change how he did his job. But he also said he understood why it was necessary. He went through the training, he practiced. And when the day came, he drove his first route on the right side. He said it felt wrong for about an hour. Then he said something clicked. His brain adjusted, and by the end of his shift it felt almost normal. Within a week, he said, driving on the left would have felt strange. That's the adaptability of human beings. We're incredibly good at adjusting to new normals. There was an elderly woman, I think her name was Ingrid, who said she simply stopped driving. She was in her 70s and had been driving on the left her whole life. The idea of switching was too much, so she gave her car to her son and stopped driving. And you know what? That's okay too. The transition worked for most people, but it wasn't mandatory that everyone continue driving. Some people made different choices. That's part of the human dimension of any major change. There were kids who thought the whole thing was exciting. To them, it was like a big national adventure. Schools had special lessons about Dagen H. Kids learned about traffic rules and road safety. They made posters. They talked about it with their friends. For them it wasn't scary, it was cool. They were part of something historic. And many of those kids, now in their 60s or 70s, still remember that sense of being part of something big. There were business owners who saw opportunity. Restaurants and cafes ran special Dagen H promotions. You could get a discount if you came in and could explain the new traffic rules. Gas stations offered Dagen H specials. Entrepreneurs created merchandise. It became a cultural moment, not just a traffic policy change. The Swedish government was smart enough to let that happen. They didn't try to control every aspect of how society responded. They let people engage with it in their own ways. That organic cultural engagement probably helped with the transition as much as any official policy. Now let's zoom out and think about this from a global perspective. Why do some countries drive on the left and others on the right anyway? The historical reasons are fascinating. The driving on the left tradition comes from horse riding and medieval combat. When you're riding a horse, if you're right-handed, you want to pass other riders on the left so your sword hand is toward them. Also, if you're mounting a horse, you mount from the left side because you wear your sword on your left hip. So it made sense to ride on the left side of the road, so you could mount from the roadside. This tradition carried over to early motor vehicles. Britain drove on the left, and so did much of its empire. That's why India, Australia, Japan, and many other countries drive on the left. The tradition of driving on the right comes from different origins. In France, teamsters driving large wagons would sit on the left rear horse, so they could use their right hand to control the team. This meant they wanted to pass oncoming wagons on the right, so they could see the clearance better. After the French Revolution, driving on the right became official policy in France, and Napoleon spread this practice to countries he conquered. The United States ended up driving on the right, partly because of anti-British sentiment after independence, and partly because of the influence of French and German immigrants who brought those traditions. As the auto industry developed, American cars had steering wheels on the left, which reinforced right-hand traffic. And as American influence spread globally, especially after World War II, more countries adopted right-hand traffic. Today, about 65% of the world drives on the right, and 35% drives on the left. But in terms of countries, most left-hand traffic countries are islands or former British colonies. The continental masses generally drive on the right. This matters for manufacturing. Most car companies primarily make left-hand drive vehicles because that's where the bigger market is. This is exactly what Sweden faced. Their domestic industry was making cars for right-hand traffic, while the country drove on the left. It was economically inefficient and it was dangerous. From a global logistics perspective, it would be more efficient if everyone drove on the same side. But at this point, the cost of switching for countries like the UK or Japan or Australia would be enormous. The benefit probably doesn't justify the cost. They have well-developed infrastructure built for left-hand traffic. They're not in the middle of continents where they're constantly crossing borders. Sweden's situation was unique. They were surrounded by right-hand traffic countries. They were integrated with that system. The cost of switching was high, but the benefit was clear. Let me talk about what happened to all the old infrastructure, all those old road signs that were replaced, all those old buses with doors on the wrong side. What happened to all of that? A lot of it was sold off. Those buses were bought by companies and municipalities in countries that drove on the left. UK, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. They got a great deal on slightly used Swedish buses. Some of the old signs ended up in museums. Today you can see collections of Dagen H Swedish road signs in transportation museums. They're historical artifacts now. Some enterprising collectors grabbed old signs and poles. Today vintage Dagen H memorabilia is collectible. Original Dagen H posters and stamps, and even that underwear I mentioned, these are items that collectors seek out. It's a piece of history, and Sweden was smart about salvaging value where they could. They didn't just throw everything in the landfill. They sold what could be sold, donated what could be donated, and only disposed of what couldn't be reused. Even in the midst of this massive transition, they thought about sustainability and waste reduction. There's an interesting philosophical question that Dagen H raises. How much of our behavior is truly fixed, and how much is just habit? Swedish people had been driving on the left for generations. It felt natural. It felt right. The idea of changing seemed impossible to many. 83% voted against it. But then they changed, and within weeks it felt natural to drive on the right. The old way felt strange. What does this tell us about human nature? I think it tells us that we're much more adaptable than we give ourselves credit for. Things that feel impossible are often just unfamiliar. Things that feel natural are often just habitual. We're creatures of habit, yes, but we're also creatures of remarkable adaptability. When we need to change, when we're given proper support and preparation, we can change. This applies to so much more than just driving. Think about any major life change, moving to a new city, starting a new job, ending a relationship, beginning a new one, major changes in routine or lifestyle. They feel impossible before you do them. They feel natural after you've done them. The transition period is uncomfortable, but humans are built to adapt. We're actually incredibly good at it. Dagen H is proof of that on a national scale. Let's talk about what didn't work or what could have been done better, because no project is perfect. One criticism was that the rural areas didn't get as much attention as urban centres. In Stockholm and Gothenburg and Malmö, the preparation was incredibly thorough. But in small towns and rural areas, the support was less comprehensive. This led to some confusion and a few more problems in those areas. Nothing catastrophic, but it wasn't quite as smooth. The lesson there is about equity in resource distribution. Major projects need to ensure that less visible communities aren't left behind. Another issue was with the elderly and disabled. While there were some special programs, they probably could have done more to support people with mobility issues or cognitive challenges.